Hello, it's Silver, and this is Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun. So yeah, I was pretty excited about this one, because even though I try to go into every game I can relatively neutral, a sort of neo-retro shooter that is based in the 40k universe is just something that seemed like a lot of fun, so yeah, I was excited for it. And after playing through all 3 episodes of the game, I've got to say it's a really good shooter. It doesn't do anything too fancy. It is not a gimmicky game. It's not like, say, Ultrakill, that basically reinvented what like a sort of boomer shooter-like thing could be. It doesn't try anything like that, but that's fine. As much as I enjoy games like that, I also enjoy games that are doing things in a more classic style and are just doing really good at it, right? They're not doing anything super fancy, but everything they're doing super well, and with a really good understanding of how to make a game like this. And definitely the devs know their 40k when it comes to the sort of presentation and overall sort of lore accuracy and things of this game. It's got a lot of sort of 40k-ish fan serviciness to it, mostly in the arsenal. The arsenal is really good in this game, but let's start off with how it looks. So it is a very chunky game. It's got a lot of dithering to it. You'll notice a lot of the colors and shading and stuff is very dithered, and it's just got a big chunky pixely sort of appearance to it. Interestingly, you can actually turn this off if you want. You can change how sort of dithered and how chunky everything is. If you don't want it to be super pixelated, you can actually slide that all the way to 0 in the options menu and have it look a little bit smoother. This is really cool. I enjoy more visual customization like this, especially in neo-retro or otherwise like old school inspired games. Having the ability to sort of say, maybe I don't want it exactly like that and want it to look a little bit different. It's nice to have those options. I'm presenting it here exactly how it comes out of the box because I thought that would be the smartest thing to do, right? Just show you exactly how it would look if you just downloaded it and turned it on yourself right now, but just know that you can alter its physical appearance quite a lot in terms of how chunky and pixely it is. But of course, we all know one of the big measures of how good a 40k game is how is the bolt gun? How's the bolter in the game? Every game has their own interpretation of exactly how it should sound and how it should feel, and in this case, the bolter feels really good. It's got a pretty nice sort of thumpy sound to it, and it just mulches enemies like very easily. Your general fodder enemies come to pieces in like 1 or 2 shots, so your basic bolter does not feel weak at all. It feels very good, and it's viable throughout a lot of the game, honestly. There won't really be a time where you can't use it. There are enemies that you don't necessarily want to use it against because they deserve something a little bit heavier, but still, even by the 3rd episode, the last levels of the game, you're still using it all the time. But the entire arsenal is honestly the high point of the game for me. It's all really good and satisfying to use. So what else do you have? Well, you've got a shotgun. The shotgun is mostly useful for clearing out large numbers of fodder enemies in front of you. It's not going to be winning you any battles in like an anti-armor kind of scenario. It's pretty weak against armored enemies, but if you've got a whole bunch of nurglings coming at you, then yeah, it can clear the screen very easily. You've also got a plasma rifle, and this is kind of the rocket launcher of the game's arsenal. I know that sounds kind of weird because a plasma weapon is not a rocket launcher, but that's sort of what it does. That's how it works in the game. It fires a medium speed projectile with a good amount of splash damage in a straight line. It's basically a rocket, although it is deceptively fast firing. If you're just clicking it, individual clicks, it won't fire very fast, and that's because when you stop clicking, it actually has a sort of cooldown animation for a second before you can fire it again. However, if you hold the mouse button down, it'll fire much faster than if you were just clicking it. Although, of course, it is a plasma weapon, so you do have to be careful doing this because after the 5th shot, the 6th and onwards will start to hurt you. It'll hurt you a lot because it'll overheat. The 6th shot doesn't do that much damage to you, but if you keep holding it down, it'll start draining your health really fast. You've also got a heavy bolter that you'll find pretty early on, which I really like. It's actually one of my favorite weapons in the game. I think that overall its sound could be a little bit bassier. I think it sounds a little bit weak for a heavy bolter. It could have a bit more of a thump to it, but still, it feels really good to use, and it works pretty much exactly like you would think, right? It's a big, huge, heavy bolter. It fires a volley of shots. It's almost like the game's minigun sort of replacement. It has a slight sort of spool-up period where it takes a second before you can actually fire it when you press the button because your character has to sort of heave it upwards and actually point it at the enemies first. But it really unleashes a lot of damage very quickly, and you can hold like 250 rounds for it, so it's really nice to have. You've got some other more exotic stuff too, like for instance the Vengeance Launcher, which is a 6-shot sticky grenade launcher, although it fires in more of a straight line than your usual video game grenade launcher does. It doesn't arc that much, but yeah, it actually does a little bit of damage when the grenade physically contacts enemies, enough to kill basic enemies in one hit, but then of course after a couple seconds it explodes. So it's very good against your like Chaos Space Marines and Chaos Terminators and things like that, because you can just sort of nail them down with it from far away and keep keep them in a pain state from all the explosions. You've also got the Volkite caliber, which is... There's also a Melta-gun, which I was happy about, because the Melta weapons in video games are always kind of a joy, because every game seems to interpret what exactly a Melta weapon is a little bit differently, and in this case, it is a drastically overpowered sort of flamethrower shotgun laser thing. It's amazing. It basically shoots a ring of fire with a deceptively very long range forward that absolutely obliterates any sort of armored target in front of you. It's very strong. You can't hold that much ammo for it, but it is one of your most powerful weapons, and it's definitely the one you're going to reach for whenever you encounter something very heavily armored or nasty in front of you all of a sudden. And then, of course, you've got the game's BFG, which is the gravity cannon, which is, well, it's a big beam that sort of sucks everything into where it impacts. It does a huge amount of damage over time to everything near the sort of impact zone of the big green laser it shoots, although it does eat through its ammo in like half a second, and you don't find that much ammo for it. But it is very good for clearing a large number of tough enemies in some of the later arenas that get particularly nasty. And yes, the game is extremely violent, exactly as you would expect from a 40k game. There's blood everywhere constantly. Enemies explode into gibs all over the place, and pretty much every weapon you have is something that is vastly more than you would need to kill a basic human, so your normal human cultist enemies just sort of come to pieces immediately as soon as you walk into the room. And then you have some more nasty demons and things later on that do explode very satisfyingly once you actually take them down. So yeah, this is definitely a very loud, very gory game. You'll even hear like pieces of enemies just flopping around the place all the time as you walk, because that's just sort of how it works. And your footsteps are also very loud because, of course, you are in power armor, you're a space marine, so you do sort of have a certain heaviness to you. This applies to your jump as well. You have a surprisingly high jump, and you can actually grab ledges and pull yourself up, although it's a little bit unreliable sometimes as to what ledges you can and can't grab. Sometimes you can tell you can, it just is a little bit hard to get it to go off occasionally, but most of the time it works okay. And also, if you fall from a high distance, you don't take damage. There's no falling damage in this game, but you do damage to everything around where you impact. So if you fall from a high distance and land in the middle of a bunch of like normal fodder enemies, then they'll all just explode into pieces immediately. You also importantly have a couple of other functions. You have a charge that you can use. It's sort of a shoulder check, a dash forward. You can mostly use it for like stunning enemies or interrupting large firing enemies and things. It does a surprising amount of damage, and also you can use it to cross certain very large gaps you otherwise wouldn't be able to jump, because if you jump at the very end of the charge, you cover a huge amount of distance. So if you learn to time it right, you can actually, well, I have a feeling it's going to be like a speed running technique, basically, because you can cover very large distances with one jump. You've also got a melee option on right-click at all times. You have a chainsword, so you can chainsword enemies. Basic enemies will die pretty much immediately from this. Tougher enemies can actually break out of it, so you have to reduce their health a little bit before you can actually chainsword them. But don't underestimate it. It is pretty powerful, even against stuff like Chaos Space Marines and things. And in some of the later episodes, the game does starve you out on ammo a little bit. At least I found. I was playing on hard, I should probably mention, so sometimes you were a little bit short on ammo, and the chainsword was definitely a good standby to have for those moments. You've also got some grenades. You have your basic frag grenades that just explode and chunk everything around them. You've got some crack grenades, which are basically anti-armor grenades. These are the kind of things that are not really about splash damage. They're more about single target, like heavy anti-armor. They're very useful against stuff like Chaos Terminators. And you've also got vortex grenades, which are basically like black hole grenades. They're super strong, but extremely rare. I've never found one of these outside of a secret. I don't think the game actually puts them in normal places. You have to find secrets to get them. Enemy variety-wise, the game definitely shines there as well. There are a lot of different enemies to face, and you start out with just your basic cultists and things with various different weapons, including stuff like autogun cultists, cultists with plasma rifles, some heavy stubber troops, which are always a big deal on hard mode and above, because the heavy stubber is basically an M2 machine gun, and it does a lot of damage to you very quickly. But once you start fighting the forces of chaos, you'll see a lot of very colorful enemies, from different kinds of Chaos Space Marines that wield all sorts of different weapons, including other bolters and plasma weapons and stuff against you. You've also got the Terminators that I mentioned, very, very heavily armored walking tanks, effectively. You've also got quite a few different kinds of demons, like your classic blue and pink horrors, and the pink horrors do actually explode into blue ones, because of course they do. You've got a ton of Nurglings, which are always a problem. On hard mode, I found that a Nurgling's acid spit can take like 20 to 40 points of your armor away from you. That's just one of them, and Nurglings are kind of like Pringles. You never only have just the one, so you've got to be careful about those guys. And then you get into some really, really nasty stuff like Lords of Change and Great Unclean Ones, for instance, which you'll face as like boss encounters multiple times. They're not just a one-off one-off boss, and they are really hard and of course very threatening and have a lot of different attacks for you to learn, oftentimes a lot of different projectiles for you to dodge and some other nasty stuff. The Lord of Change specifically has something that's kind of like an Archvile's attack, like a sort of line of sight-based fire underneath you, but it does a lot of damage. And you've got some other really crazy designs as well. So like I said, the devs definitely know their Warhammer because they've really delved into, they've dipped into the chaos bestiary to give you a very good variety of stuff so that, you know, it doesn't get old. You want a lot of different enemies to face with such a good arsenal. That's part of the point. You want to have a whole bunch of different enemies to learn how to actually use your various weapons against, and the game definitely does that very well. There's also a lot of power-ups in this game, which is a nice classic feel. You know, back when games had stuff that floated off the ground and sort of spun in place, that sort of stuff, there's a bunch of that. From your obvious stuff like health and armor, which in this game is called Contempt because, of course, it's 40k. You'll also find a lot of other power-ups, like one that gives you an overcharged ammo pool, so you can actually hold temporarily more ammo than you can normally hold for a while, which is really nice. And you'll tend to find it in secrets in very large arenas. There's a sort of melee berserk power-up that makes you see everything all bloody and stuff. It's how I imagine the Blood Angels probably see all the time. You can also find a big sort of fist in a cog, which is a sort of like a quad damage power-up that's also usually in really big arenas hidden somewhere. And sometimes you can also find this laurel power-up that's usually hidden in very high places that overcharges you up to 300 contempt upon acquiring it, which is really nice. You'll also, by the way, be able to find the occasional magazine of special ammo for your bolter. These are usually in secrets and are very nice to have. You can find stuff like Dragonfire rounds, which are sort of like air-bursting incendiary ammunition. You can also find Kraken rounds, which feel sort of like firing angry bees at your target, which is, it's about right, actually. They're sort of like explosive needles, more or less. And then there's also the Vengeance rounds, which you'll occasionally find. I actually don't know a lot about Vengeance rounds, like in the lore. I'm pretty sure they're like a sort of unstable armor-piercing kind of thing, so it's basically like armor-piercing ammo for people that want to shave off bits of their soul by carrying it. So yeah, you've got a really solid arsenal in this game and a bunch of different power-ups to complement it, so this means that the overall moment-to-moment combat in the game is phenomenal. It's really good, very chunky, very satisfying, weighty combat with really fun weapons and really nice power-ups that are rewarding to find, and it feels classic, it feels old school, it feels like a very retro shooter, but with sort of higher, more modern production values, basically. The level design is where a lot of the developers' knowledge of 40k is shown off. The levels are very detailed, like extremely detailed, sometimes over-detailed, but that's purposeful, right? That's sort of the point, because the Imperium has this sort of penchant for taking a whole bunch of scripture and skulls and cogs and symbols like that and just putting them everywhere, to the point where there's like ribbons and seals and stuff hanging off the walls, and yeah, everything is almost over-designed a little bit on purpose, and it looks really good. It looks like 40k, and you have a good variety of locales as well. You'll be on a sort of icy forge world at first, but you'll eventually end up in more of like a sort of desert canyon environment. You'll have some interior environments to go through that are all metal and blood, and then of course you'll have some chaos architecture with some really cool screen effects that really mess with your eyes to show that everything is chaos infested, and a bunch of sort of MC Escher like pathways and stairwells that go to nothing and all warp around each other and stuff that make the level a little bit difficult to navigate. Sometimes I will admit some of the more chaos infested levels can be a little bit hard to get around at first because of all the interconnected portals and things and the messed up gravity that makes them sort of mind-bending, but that's also obviously on purpose, right? That's the point. Progression-wise, you're going to see a pretty much a 50-50 split directly between enemies that are already on the field and you're exploring around more sort of linear but relatively wide open environments, and then there's the big arenas where you walk into a big room, you get shut in there, and like 6 squintillion demons spawn and try to kill you. So you have pretty much, like I said, a 50-50 split between the more traditional like neo-retro exploration stuff and the almost painkiller style lock you in an arena with very nasty thing that wants to kill you. And because of the very good map design, you have some really memorable set-piece battles in a lot of these big arenas, right? The exploration is also fun and tends to be very rewarding with all the power-ups, as I previously mentioned, but when it comes to the actual set-piece battles, the big arenas, they are good. They don't get old because they don't last for too long. They don't overstay their welcome. They are well-paced, I feel, and they tend to be quite difficult. Like I said, I did play this game through on hard, the second hardest difficulty, because I was a little bit afraid of the hardest difficulty, which is called Exterminatus. But after finding the game pretty manageable so far, I'll probably go back and try some levels in that very hard difficulty to see what it's like, because I think the overall experience on hard has been manageable, right? There have been some big set-piece battles with stuff like Lords of Change phasing in and a whole bunch of chosen champions appearing and stuff like that that become really quite evil in terms of what they lock you in the room with, but they've all still been manageable, right? Some of them have taken me like 4 or 5 tries, but I've always been able to actually win. And most of that comes down to how enjoyable your arsenal is to use and how well you get to know each weapon's strength against different enemies. Oh yeah, one thing I gotta mention, by the way, the game sort of borrows a little bit from the tabletop 40k, where your weapons have a strength rating and enemies have a toughness rating. If you don't overcome the toughness rating with your weapon's strength, then you'll do reduced damage. So if you're using a shotgun against a Chaos Space Marine, it'll still hurt, but it won't hurt that much, and you'll be very inefficient with your ammo, so it's something that you only really want to do if you absolutely have to. Whereas if you're using your normal bolter against them, then it matches their toughness, so it'll do normal base damage. But if you use something like, say, the Meltagun, it drastically overpowers their toughness, so it'll basically one-shot them. And it's something that you just got to be careful about, because different enemies have different toughness ratings, and I was a little bit surprised when I saw this at first. It's not what I expected in like a neo-retro shooter to actually take a cue from like the tabletop RPG mechanics, but I think it fits pretty well because of the very large amount of enemy variety. It means that you always have sort of different weapons for the job, and you've got to learn how to use each one efficiently. So yeah, Boltgun is a really, really good old school shooter. It is just fantastic for shooter fans in general. If you like fun FPS, then this is for you, but also it's really good for 40k fans because it really immerses you in a very well realized bit of map design and fun weapons and stuff, so that if you are familiar with 40k already, you'll definitely get something extra out of it too. You don't have to be though. So yeah, I will link you in the description below this video, of course, to the Steam store page for this game, so you can go and check it out yourself. Definitely do give it a shot. It is a lot of fun. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.